people are dying less of TB, but at the same time, there's actually much more attention is being directed towards eradicating TB. And again, this is why it's really important to recognize the social aspects of the history of medicine, because so much of why people are trying to eradicate and fight TB is because of a fear they have about the links between TB and the poor state of housing, child health, and also the efficiency of the nation. So this idea that, you know, because TB has really, it's a long-lasting disease, right? It really does like disable you for a long period, and it can take a long time for it to eventually get you, essentially. And the idea would be that, you know, as we're these big nation states competing with each other, like Germany and France and the USA and the UK, you know, if we have a young population that's riddled with TB now and the effects of TB, they're the soldiers and the workers of the future. So how are we going to compete on a global stage?
Hello, I'm Natalie from Genealogy Stories, and welcome to Twice Removed, the show where we talk about everything history related. Hi there, Laura. I'm here today with Laura Newman, who is a historian of medicine, particularly in the workplace, and part of the exciting Addressing Health project. So I'm really excited to talk to you about health, medicine, postal workers. Should be a bit of an eclectic mix.
Yeah.
So I'll dive in. Can you tell me a little bit about the Addressing Health project to start with?
Yeah, so the Addressing Health project is a Wellcome funded project, funded by the Wellcome Trust. It's going on for 3 years, so we're just about a year in. And what we're doing is we're really trying to look at the health of the postal workforce as a whole from around the 1850s to around 1908. Is what we have for this period. We have an amazing set of records about the health of the postal workforce. So it was one of the biggest employers in this period. By 1901, it was employed around 167,000 people, one in around 20% of whom were women, and all across the UK, or what was then the UK. So, you know, from the smallest fishing village in Aberdeen to, you know, the big postal sorting offices in London, you know, the post office had an extensive range. So it's really great for historians of health to think about, you know, what the health of the population was like generally at that time, right? And one of the things that makes the record so unique is it really gives us insight into morbidity. So morbidity is different from mortality. So historians have traditionally looked a lot at mortality, so what people have died of, to get a clue as to, you know, what the health of people in the past was like. But the issue with that is, you know, people don't just live life as completely disease, condition-free people, and then suddenly drop dead of like TB or cancer when they're 75, right? People live with different kinds of conditions all over their lives. So what we can do, for example, is we can look at the pension records of, we think it's around 30,000 pensioners we're aiming to look at, right, from 1858 to 1908. So we can see stuff like how long they were off sick for. We can also look at the reasons why they retired, which again might not necessarily be the reasons why they died. And then we can do interesting stuff like thinking about like, okay, so people in Ireland, what were they retiring of that people in England or Wales or Scotland weren't retiring of? And how did that relate to, you know, difference between rural and urban, you know, differences in health and differences in age and gender. So really it's working with a really fantastic data set to answer some really key questions about the lived experiences of health in this period, which is something we're obviously all really excited about.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. So more of a holistic look at health rather than necessarily just what you died of, what the things that you had to live with. Yeah, I should think that'll be really interesting. I can't wait to see how the project develops. So I know when we were talking off camera in prep for the interview, you mentioned that people might be surprised at how early people retired from the post office service, and I just wondered whether you could tell us sort of when they retired and why it was so early.
Yeah, so there were two sort of chief reasons for retiring in this period. So one was through ill health and the other was through age. So that was reaching the age of around 60, later 65 years old. So what we found, and I should mention here, because this is a project that has been limited to a great extent by COVID. We haven't been able to get into the archives nearly as much as we'd want to. I'm having horrible archive withdrawal symptoms at the moment. Over a year since I've been to an archive, it's horrific. So everything we're saying right now is based upon like a small sample, so like, our findings might change. So we're actually finding that actually 2/3 of workers retired from ill health rather than from age. And why that's significant is we're thinking about the pension, thinking about the way post office pensions worked, is they were non-contributory, and also they were based upon your length of service. So it actually benefited you to stay in your office for as long as you could, because that would mean you would retire with a better pension. There were also added on benefits like things for good conduct. So, you know, if you retired early, that is quite a good indicator to us that something was wrong. So we're finding that the average age of someone who retired from ill health from the post office was around 47 years old, and they served from around 22 to 23 years in the post office on average, so quite a long time. And the interesting thing we're also finding about that is because we're tracing them after they retired, so we're looking at death certificates for people who retired in census years. That's something I do a lot of on the project, so a lot of going on free BMD and being like, is this the right Jack Smith? No, I don't know. And then having to go to Ancestry and look at the census. So yeah, we will find the death certificate for Jack Smith, and obviously that will show when he died and what he died of. So by that, we're able to look at, so if we know Jack Smith retired from the post office due to ill health in 1881, and he died in 1885, that means he only got 4 years additional life, right, on from that. Whereas those who retired due to old age actually lived a fair bit longer after that. So we are finding some really interesting patterns, looking at why people retired, and also geographically finding, that people in urban centres tended to retire earlier than their rural counterparts as well.
I find that's really interesting. So I found that really interesting that they got a pension actually, full stop. So because I should imagine that was not. Well, yeah, I'd imagine that wasn't common. That was one of the pluses of being employed on the post office. And was that pension in place right from 1850, or was that something that slowly came about?
So what I can tell you is that what I can tell you about this period is because it was the civil service department, there was a real reputational risk to the post office if they had people who'd been working for them for 20 years, and then you would find out, for example, that they died in the workhouse, impoverished, right? So the pension was there both to attract people to come to work for them, to retain them too. But it was also, as a branch of government, the post office had to be cognizant of these kind of issues as well. Other branches of the civil service also had pensions in this period. So like the Inland Revenue and teachers too from the 1870s onwards had pensions as well. And some companies had voluntary, private companies had pensions too as well. And really it's all about attracting the workforce, a good workforce to come work for you, and making sure they don't drop out of work as well. That's the kind of key reasons why pensions were introduced. And just to say as well, on our website we have links to all the talks we've given, and one of them is on the history of pensions in the post office by my colleague Kathleen McElvenna.
Oh, brilliant.
So just a plug for our website here, addressinghealth.uk, addressinghealth.org.uk. Let me check that's actually right. Yep, addressinghealth.org.uk, where you can watch some presentations we've given on various topics related to postal history. And Kathleen McElvenna, our fantastic, someone else is on the team who did her PhD on pensions in the post office, has really fantastic talks of illustrating their history.
That's brilliant. I find that really interesting because I have a postal worker in my family tree.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. Well, he was in a tiny little village called Tiddenham in Gloucestershire. So he would have been a rural postman, essentially. But he actually got sacked for stealing out of the letters.
Yes.
So there's a really great newspaper clipping that reports that basically, I don't know it's now that I'm saying newspapers, I'm wondering if it's newspapers or the criminal report that I found, one of the two, but it basically says that his employer suspected him of opening the letters and obviously trying to steal money and things out of them, and they asked him to turn out his pockets, which he did, and he had no letters in them, and then they said, and now can you take off your hat? And what he'd been doing, he'd been stuffing the letters into his hat. But they kind of describe him as having barely any teeth, and so you kind of get this sense of this kind of like bumbling country hick that's bless him, that's really struggling for money, and has resorted to desperate measures. And obviously he loses his job, and then he spends the rest of his life working as a gardener. So which obviously would have been still quite, labor intensive.
Very much so.
But and that was the end of that. So his short postal career. So finding out that he possibly could have had a pension as well, I'd have to check what date he was arrested, makes that desperation must have been even greater to put that at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done some early work in this area. So we had an undergraduate research fellow at King's College, which is where I and some other people on the team are based, look at how we can look at the idea of postal crime, and that typically refers to people stealing money out of letters. And you have to think, like, sometimes when people are sending postal orders of like £5, and if your yearly wage was something like £45, that's a lot of money, right, to just sort of be handed, right? And we were looking at court records at the Old Bailey, so just in London, so our source sample was kind of limited, to think about, what kind, and there was a reference to someone who said that his child was in hospital, right? So there is a degree to which, again, I think like you do with your ancestor, you have to sort of imagine that detail about the teeth is really interesting, because that again is really indicative that, he might not have been able to afford the services of a dentist. And then thinking about the temptation that these huge amounts of money pose, is and the relationship that had to like their welfare and their health in general is something I find really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know they were living in a very small home with other people as well, so it wasn't, it was shared, and that his wife was working as a laundress, so you start to get that kind of social economic picture. But it is really interesting. So if he hadn't have pilfered through the letters, what kind of health issues though might he have looked forward to? What kind of issues led to retirement or earlier retirement?
Yeah, so this very much depended on what type of work you did and where. So if we're sticking with, what was your ancestor's name? I feel like
George Davis. So.
Okay, if we stick with George, right? So George, as a rural postman, could have expected to retire from a lot of the issues you would, I think, naturally associate with walking really long routes, right? So you would have expected him to maybe retire for orthopedic issues, musculoskeletal conditions, and also feet as well, like bunions, gout, I see quite a lot of as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Also sometimes respiratory conditions as well. And then there was this very ubiquitous category of worn out, which appears a lot in the pension records, the reason why someone retired. So that could have been a euphemism for old age a lot of the time, a kind of premature aging too. So one of the things I'm interested in the project as historian of medicine, and other people on the project are with this kind of background, is thinking about what precisely qualified as being worn out. Because as a historian, you see all these conditions, and some of them seem very recognizable, right? Like everyone knows what cancer is, everyone knows what sciatica is. Sciatica is another big one. But when you see worn out, that seems really imprecise to our modern eyes. That seems really like, what's that? So part of our job is to reconstruct, what exactly worn out meant, and if it meant the same thing every single time. So they will be retiring from musculoskeletal conditions, often foot conditions, But when we move more towards the urban centres and we move towards the people doing indoor work for the post office, so postmen were outdoor workers. Indoor workers, the people working the big sorting offices and big like telegraph offices, they were often retiring for very different reasons. They were often retiring due to a number of conditions that we have included under the umbrella of mental health.
Okay.
Which is a bit of a sticky category in this period, especially with the ways Victorians thought about mental health. So this would have been things like nervous exhaustion, nervous stability, but also like melancholia, you know, so we would probably, again, nervous stability might seem a bit foreign and strange to our ears today. Melancholia, we kind of all vaguely know what that means.
Nervous stability be like anxiety?
Yes, so the issue here is it could well have been, but the Victorian doctors had a very interesting understanding of the relationship between the nervous system and the body. So it could have meant something to do with the brain, because today we often see mental illness and these kind of disorders as originating in the brain. Whereas Victorian doctors, sorry, this is me going off on a segue.
No, this is brilliant. No, please do.
they had a slightly more, there was a lot more debate over to the relationship between the brain and the symptoms of nervous and mental illness stuff. So there was a lot of discussion about the role the whole body played in mental illness. So when I see the words like nervous stability and nervous exhaustion, I think there's a degree into which I think that the doctors making those diagnoses might have thought about the idea of the nerves literally being frayed and worn out. So it could have meant even something, about like just conjecturing here, it could have meant something like, a disease of the nervous system that we see today. So the ways in which, today a condition like MS would be seen as very distinct from like a mental illness, it would be seen as a mental illness, and the ways in which like epilepsy, for example, today is not thought of as a mental illness. Back in the Victorian period, those boundaries were a lot fuzzier. So sorry, that was just a little segue. So
no, that's really interesting. I find that really fascinating, because I know, like, I've kind of been aware of just through studying English Lit and looking at sensational novels and things like that. So I've got a little bit of awareness of the concept of hysteria and like the idea of a woman's womb being able to wander through her body, causing random moments of hystericalness. But I hadn't realised that relationship with the body and the brain was so fluid, if that's the right word.
It's very it was very interesting that the boundaries between the brain, the body, and mental illness were often quite fuzzy and imprecise, and there were lots of just ideas and conjectures and hypotheses floating around in this period as well. So it could, it was an interesting time. It's not my area of expertise so much, the history of mental health treatment, but it's Victorian doctors had some wacky ideas, basically.
So when you're working on this project and you're reading these retirement papers, you're having to kind of play detective to a certain degree and try and work out what they might have meant by some of these conditions, or?
Yeah. So the thing to note here is that the post office had its own medical service, which was established in 1855. And the role of this service was to provide treatment for post workers if they were earning under a certain amount. They provided free advice to everyone, though. So, if you were a very rich postmaster on £150 a year, you could still go to your post office medical officer for advice. Sometimes they were full-time postal employees. Sometimes they were doctors who were contracted out. And obviously, these guys were often certifying and inspecting people and writing down the reasons why this person was retiring. So the issue here, and again, we've got a PhD student, I should say, who's working on the post office medical service. The problem is that there's hundreds of doctors under the employ of the post office, right? I think hundreds, maybe dozens. I'm not quite sure of the numbers, but there were a lot. And each one of these doctors had a distinct training. They will have all gone to different medical schools at different times, because the culture of medical education in this period was very different. So in Scotland, which had a very, very old tradition of medical education, right? You know, so again, when I'm looking at the reasons why Scottish postal workers, their reasons for retirement, I'm having to think, okay, so these are the doctors who probably went to Glasgow and Edinburgh and St Andrews, and so are they coming from a different intellectual background than those down south, right, or those in Ireland? So that's one of the tricky things, because the doctors, again, like the postal pensioners, are individuals too. They have their own biases, they have their own ideas about things. So that's one of the really tricky issues when you're playing with such large amounts of data like this, is you're having to deal not with just a nameless mass, this like big thing of like medicine and the medical doctor, like they're individuals with, you know, their own kind of professional opinions and things like that. So that's often really hard.
I think that's really interesting. I think that will really interest a lot of family historians as well, because we quite often order our ancestors' death certificates and then have to try and work out, you know, exactly what something might have meant. And yeah, it's worth bearing in mind that might not always be the same thing. So as in, you might hear, you know, I don't know. I think it was one ancestor I had who had like death by teeth, you know, which is, you know, decay, you presume would be a abscess in the mouth, or a decay, or I've had that a few times, and I know other people have had it, and they've had it with abscess or something. So you kind of get this idea that there's different meanings, but I think that's really useful for us to know. So what kind of you sort of briefly mentioned mental health, and nowadays I think we're much more aware of stress and the role that stress can have on both on our mental health and on our physical health as well. Did they have a concept of stress in the kind of Victorian Edwardian period?
Yeah, no, they absolutely did. And I think especially in the time we're sort of talking about, so you have so in around the from about the 1860s onwards, the post office goes through a period of intense modernization, right? And becomes really the big bureaucratic, efficient organization we know today. And there are lots of drives towards modernization and efficiency. So, and obviously at the time, we're also thinking we're having this great communications revolution. So we get, for example, the telegraphs become nationalized in the 1870s. And so you get all the telegraphists moving to the post office. So, you know, their workforce expands. So we're getting the growth of telegraphy. We're getting the growth of letters with the introduction of the penny black in the 1840s. We're getting also, importantly, the expanding borders of the empire. So, and really the post office is the central communications hub, and it's linking all these really disparate elements and peoples of the empire together. So what comes with that, and we also get the introduction of the parcel service in the 1880s, I should say, as well. So what comes with that is an intensification of work and the pace of work. And so people are working really intense hours a lot of the time. So especially in London, there are often reports of postmen and sorters doing double shifts. So they'd be working sometimes up to 16 hours a day. The telegraphists would be working up to 8-10 hours a day as well. And what the medical doctor would have thought at this time, especially, is they would have thought that the repetitive work would be particularly damaging for someone. So this idea, so something like doing a repetitive, you know, on the telegraph key, or sorting the same parcels again and again, and just doing something very monotonous, they thought that was intensely damaging. And there was just a kind of more vague, and I'm sure you know this from your time doing English literature, like turn of the century, especially this idea that modern life was just getting too fast for some people. And so you actually get a new kind of neurotic diseases sort of spring up in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And so much of that is tied to the conditions of urban living and the speed at which, you know, people are now living their lives. And really the post office was facilitating that speeding up in a very important way. So, but, you know, there were people doing that speeding up, right? There were people there who were making sure, you know, if you posted a letter, at this time it got to the address the next day. If you did a telegraph, it got there, a parcel, etc. So, you know, they were really, you know, in the sort of great incubator of modern day stress, right? Having to do this work, connecting all these people.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably really easy to forget now because we just like ping an email of actually how reliant, you know, thinking from just a business perspective,
yeah,
but even from a personal perspective of receiving letters from your loved ones, but like literally making businesses go around, that ability to communicate was all done by snail mail, by hand, by telegraph. Yeah. So how did they kind of treat their workers in terms of stress? Was there a kind of, you know, any sort of occupational health as such? You know, like we would have somebody come in and check that you're sat, you know, in big corporations, you'd have somebody come in and check your desk, wouldn't you, and that you're sat properly and that kind of thing. You know, was there a kind of slightly Victorian equivalent, or was it very much like, well, this is stressful and that's tough?
No, so I'd say probably somewhere in the middle. So I'd say they had the Post Office Medical Service, who you know, would inspect workers fairly regularly to check, you know, they were doing okay. But it's important not to see it as too altruistic, right? Because the Post Office Medical Service were there for management to check that people were working efficiently and working well. So, you know, the idea of health is not just this like, in the workplace is not just this kind of benevolent paternalistic employer, right? It's tied to productivity. It's tied to making sure the post office continues to be efficient. So you had Post Office Medical Service, you know, kind of giving something in the way of occupational health, you know, providing treatment for people if they needed it, occasionally providing home visits if you lived within a certain radius, and providing advice too. The problem is, you know, as much as that has good and as enlightened as that sounds, you know, from the end initially, you know, when you actually look at what the workers' associations and the unions often say, is they often say that these post office medical officers are very intrusive. They say that, you know, there are actually a lot of factors in, particularly offices that that the post office are very negligent about. So they talk a lot about the lack of sufficient lavatory provision, so not enough toilets, the amount of dust that builds up in there, you know, the poor ventilation. So yeah, so often the workers themselves were actually taking on quite an active role in occupational health themselves and really agitating for change themselves. So it was sort of a mixture of, you know, both the Post Office Medical Service, but also I think it's important to recognise the role that workers played too.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thinking about the actual work itself, especially when you were talking about letter sorting and you know, in current times, I think we're much more conscious about touching things. Did they have any particular concerns about I don't know, ill ventilation and touching letters and that kind of spread of illness? What were their kind of thoughts around that?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting period of post office history and something that before I joined the project, I wrote quite extensively on. And a very interesting episode in the history of the relationship between the world of medicine and the world of the post office was the growth in pathological specimens that made their way through the postal system. So essentially, in this period, we see a real growth in the capacity for diagnosing infectious diseases like TB, like syphilis, like diphtheria, right? So what's happening a lot of the time is that patients or doctors are sending samples of spit or blood or urine via the post to big research laboratories and hospitals in London. You know, so then they can like write back and be like, we found evidence of TB in this spit, right? Initially, this was actually illegal, but lots of doctors did it anyway. So they had a big hoo-ha, big load of negotiation with the post office management. And eventually they are allowed through with quite fairly strict conditions about how they were packaged. But what happens inevitably is as, you know, this diagnostic testing industry grows, as more and more, as the tests become cheaper, more and more of these specimens are making their way through the post office. But the big issue at the same time is the post office is also getting mechanized. So you can imagine you have a little spit, a vial of spit that's been packaged okay, but not super well, is then dropped from a mag elevator and then taken through the post office railway. You then get a sorter lifting it up. Oh no, what's happening? My hands are covered in spit or blood, right? And so there were quite frequent complaints made by the post office unions and workers associations about this, saying, we are now very much at risk for developing diphtheria or TB, or the big one that they were often really worried about was syphilis, because you can imagine syphilis has a lot of moral connotations with it about sexual impropriety. So this idea of like, we could be getting syphilis and, someone would think, I was an adulterous man and I simply was doing my job. So that was a big thing. And there were often other things as well. So it wasn't just the specimens, pathological specimens. That's quite an interesting little bit of postal history, but more common everyday things that made their way through the post office, right? Like paper. There was a lot of debate in this period over whether paper could carry germs. And the post office actually, so the system of disinfecting post and disinfecting parcels actually goes back quite a long time, way before it was commonly accepted that diseases like cholera or the plague were caused by a germ, right? They would disinfect these often a lot of the time. There's actually a really interesting history of postal quarantining. So they would often inject these letters or like treat them with like creosote and carbolic. So the same thing that was being used in surgeries at this time, right? And they would treat the letters with these. And they were doing this, the post office, up to the 1880s, specifically because if you're getting stuff that's coming in from the empire, we're having great kind of cholera outbreaks in this period in like the Indian subcontinent. And then also later in the I actually am quite bad at dates, but in the late 19th century, we get the third plague outbreak in India as well. And that obviously has big ramifications for what is allowed to come into Britain from these places. So yeah, that was a very long answer to the question, but it's also something I've written a lot on. So
yeah, I must admit, I'm really amazed by that, because I kind of presumed that certainly sort of in the 1850s to maybe say 1880s that they might have still thought of the kind of old miasma theories, but is that kind of well gone by that period?
So miasmas are really interesting. I think sometimes when like with certain things, when we think about what caused disease, right, or what people thought caused disease, I think a lot of the narrative is everyone thinks it was like 4 humours, then miasmas, and suddenly we get germs with like Pasteur in the middle of the 19th century. In actuality, it's like obviously of all things in history, it's a lot more complicated, and everything bleeds together in a much more interesting way. So miasmas are interesting because, and germs specifically, because there was always the possibility in medicine of this idea of a contagion of a biological contagion that people couldn't see. So even though they didn't know it was germs, right, people were often alive to the fact that there was probably something that caused the onset of a disease. Miasma could be one of these things, but they also allowed for the possibility of lots of other different factors too.
I've always thought miasma was pretty logical as well, and actually makes a lot of sense, because it
does.
The idea that, not being around things that smell bad and it being in the air, essentially, to a layman like me who knows nothing about medicine, germs kind of are in the air, because it kind of like makes sense. Not that I was miasma believing doctor, but
so this is one of the really interesting things, is that I think a lot of the time we tend to see medical practice in the past as like ignorant, and we kind of tend to feel like they believed what. But actually, it does, like, put yourself in their shoes for a moment. It does make sense, and actually, the stuff they were doing was helpful. It was beneficial. They were installing sewer systems. They were cleaning out ditches, which would have been reservoirs of waterborne disease bacteria. They didn't know there were reservoirs of waterborne disease bacteria. But still, the outcome was the same. The outcome was still effective and beneficial for people's health. even if, you know, the premise was wrong, right? So
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a really interesting thing about, you know, the history of medicine, I think.
Certainly cholera, hadn't they? I think, am I right in thinking cholera, they had begun to realise that it was something to do with water, because didn't they have one water pump? My really vague memory of a water pump and all the and cholera.
John Snow Broad Street pump in Soho, in the 1850s. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. So there was a recognition, you know, that water definitely played a role in transmitting disease, and also food too. You know, there's definitely a recognition that so like food poisoning, for example, there was this idea of poisons that were in certain foods, that as foods decayed, they kind of built up poisons. They were called like ptomaines, or I can't pronounce it. I can spell it, but I can't say it. You know, and then it's like later in the late 1880s that we start to get like identification of like the salmonella germs. But before that, you know, people thought there were poisons in the meat that were gradually building up. You know, so even before, I don't know if anyone here is watching the Terror, but you know, obviously that is it's very good because it's about the Franklin expedition, and they had tainted meat that probably some people suggest had botulism in it. You know, and this is a complete digression.
No, go. Digressions are great.
No, it's just I really like the history of food poisoning. Like it. So you know, that's actually a really good example of like, you know, how people were aware just from their sensory environment, from like looking at things and smelling things and inspecting things, that something wasn't quite right.
And in a lot of ways, they're kind of right, aren't they? Because in a lot of times, food that goes off is a bacteria that's growing. So in a sense, they were right in that this thing is happening. Yeah. It's really, I'm always amazed that we ever invented things like penicillin, that somebody ever thought that this mold on a piece of bread might do something. You know, it's fascinating. So they were concerned about spreading illnesses. Okay. And I know that you've done a lot of research into TB. Is that because it was a particular fear?
Yeah, so the really interesting thing about TB in the 19th century is actually TB rates are going down. So TB has killed more people, it's estimated, than any other infectious disease in history. And it still is a major killer, which I think a lot of people don't quite realize. So the interesting thing about TB is rates are going down. So less and less people are dying from it. There's a lot of debate over why this is, and I won't go into those, but people are dying less of TB. But at the same time, there's actually much more attention is being directed towards eradicating TB. And again, this is why it's really important to recognize the social aspects of the history of medicine, because so much of why people are trying to eradicate and fight TB is because of a fear they have about the links between TB and the poor state of housing, child health, and also the efficiency of the nation. So this idea that, you know, because TB has really, it's a long-lasting disease, right? It really does like disable you for a long period, and it can take a long time for it to eventually get you, essentially. And the idea would be that, you know, as we're these big nation states competing with each other, like Germany and France and the USA and the UK, you know, if we have a young population that's riddled with TB now and the effects of TB, they're the soldiers and the workers of the future. So how are we going to compete on a global stage? And this idea that, you know, we can do something to eradicate TB. In the post office, this kind of finds expression, this kind of anxiety about TB finds expression through a activist called Charles Garland, who was a telegraphist, who in 1903 established something called the Post Office Sanatorium Society, which is a friendly society. So it's a worker-led society where people contribute a small amount each week. And if they contract TB, then they can get access to sanatorium treatment. And they actually build their own sanatorium, the Post Office Sanatorium Society in Kent. And they're really worried about TB rates. Charles Garland's really worried about TB rates in the post office. He sees it as disproportionately affecting telegraphists. So again, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, these people who were working indoors in what, you know, a lot of people saw as very unhealthy conditions. And they were, right, like for spreading respiratory disease. I mean, there's one thing this pandemic has shown us, it's the importance of like good ventilation for stopping the spread of respiratory conditions.
I was going to say, actually, how do you get TB?
How
is TB, you know, contracted?
So yeah, the interesting thing about TB is because TB can affect pretty much anywhere in your body. It depends slightly, but mostly it's spread by aerosol through coughing or sneezing. In this period, they thought spitting spread it as well, because they detected, scientists, bacteriologists detected TB bacteria in spit. And the idea would be, spitting used to be a much more ubiquitous behavior than it is now. As people spat and then the spit dried up and it became dust, then that dust had TB germs in it. I'm not a bacteriologist or a disease specialist by like any stretch of the imagination, but I'm pretty sure that is not how you catch TB. It's not a risk. And that's why often you'll see like no spitting signs in old photographs and on old, especially railway carriages, a thing as well. But the Post Office Sanatorium Society campaigned to have no spitting signs put up in sorting offices in 1901. Because, you know, they talked about the layers of dust that had accrued over the years of like from tuberculous spit. So yeah, it's made for aerosol, but like if you're interested in TB in your ancestor, there are other ways to catch TB or contract it. So one of the more interesting ones, interesting, is you can contract tuberculosis from humans, but you can also contract it through infected milk, so milk that's been, TB is a mammalian disease, right? And cows are often very liable to catching TB, as I'm sure most people are aware. So what would happen a lot in this period is, as you had raw unpasteurized milk, a lot of these cows' milk would be infected with TB. So if you drank unpasteurized, untreated milk that had TB in it, you could contract TB from that. And often what you do from that is you contract something called laryngeal TB, which is quite a nasty form of TB because it affects your throat. Because as the milk's going down, you know, the TB germs are kind of spreading in your throat. And children were often particularly liable, especially to like the more nasty pernicious forms of TB. So not just pulmonary, they were liable to this laryngeal form, but also what else? Brain, tubercular meningitis as well. They were particularly liable to that. So yeah, that's how TB spreads.
Oh, I'm fascinated because my partner was, his family's all from Belfast, and as far as I can see, certainly sort of in the 1860s, they all seem to die from tuberculosis, like on all sides of his family. And I know Belfast was a bit of a tuberculosis capital at one point. So I find tuberculosis really quite interesting. Am I right in thinking there was a bit of a stigma attached to tuberculosis because it was associated with poverty?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing here is it wasn't necessarily that it was associated with poverty, because actually quite a lot of middle class, well-to-do people caught TB as well. So whilst it was kind of gradually remade as a disease of poverty in the late 19th century, it wasn't just affecting the poor. I think what's interesting here, and I think what's interesting from a family history point of view especially, is so before the TB germ was isolated and identified, perhaps the most popular explanation for TB was that it was hereditary. So it was this idea that you either caught it directly from a relative, or like inherited it directly from the relative, because don't forget this is a time of Charles Darwin, so people having lots of really interesting ideas about evolution and hereditary, like kind of sciences. But there was this other idea that families just had a hereditary predisposition towards TB. And so there was this idea that you had that the whole family was kind of tainted with it, right? And this makes like quite a lot of sense. Again, if you're looking at it from an outsider's perspective, like forgetting what we know about germs and TB, you know, a lot of these cases of TB were caused by families who were living in horribly overcrowded conditions, right? So this idea that you had a tubercular family was really popular. And again, lots of doctors continue to believe that hereditary factors were really important in explaining why people got TB. So, and there's actually, I thinking of Ireland again, I'm not sure of research elsewhere on this, but actually in the post-war period, so 70 odd years after the TB germ was first identified, lots of people still thought that TB ran in families. They didn't think the germ played a super important role. Lots of them still thought family was the most important factor.
I can understand
people
that.
were isolated.
Yeah, I can understand that, especially if it took time to develop. So it could seem like a slowly getting worse, gradual thing. I think we tend to associate that kind of thing more with hereditary diseases.
Yeah,
so that does make a lot of sense. So what if you did contact track TB? You mentioned the sanatoriums and the Friendly Society. What was a sanatorium, and what kind of treatment might you get for TB?
Right. Yeah. So sanatoria first come in the middle of the 19th century, and really, although sanatoria do they do kind of offer pharmaceutical treatment, sometimes surgical treatment too. Really, the most important thing about sanatoria is this idea of regularity of habit and of exercise and of diet, right? And it's also about it's also about environment. It's about removing the poor urban sorter or postman away from the corrupting effects of the London air. Because if we think air quality in cities now is bad, back then it was like truly horrific, right? This idea that we would remove them to somewhere with the fresh regenerative effects of the countryside air. Or if you were very rich, you would go to Switzerland and go high up in the mountains, with beautiful forests. And what you would do is you would either have, there were lots of different treatments, but you would have bed rest, for example. So that was a thing. But in the late 19th century, and especially at the Post Office Sanatorium Society's sanatorium in Kent, they had something called graduated labour, which was medical exercise, essentially. This idea that if you exercise, the white blood cells in your body would fight the TB infection. It would be activated by you moving. But when you look at it, like, they were asking them to do really intense manual labor with a quite severe respiratory condition. So it'd be like, dig a ditch, walk 5 miles, right? And so actually a lot of the time these people were complaining that this is too severe for me, this is too harsh. So that was a treatment that became popular, especially amongst the working class tuberculosis patient in the turn of the century, because it was seen as, the natural state of the working class man is to work. And so we should restore him to work, and that way his body will heal. And there were lots of other, yeah, I know.
It's so unbelievable as well, because you think, like, surely if physical exercise was going to ward you off or cure TB, the people that had already been laboring really hard miraculously getting better on their own.
Yeah, you would think so.
Yeah,
and there were lots of,
a lot of really interesting social ideas there, I think.
Yeah, no, there absolutely are. It's very much, when you read some of the justifications these doctors are putting forward for using exercise in treating TB, it's yeah. And there are various other things as well, like so if you had TB of the skin, sunlight therapy. There were some wacky ideas as well. So like using gold, like injections of gold, because gold was found to be effective in laboratory tests in killing the TB bacteria. So then doctors just ran with that idea and started injecting people with a derivative of gold. But with that, people were just getting really sick. They were getting poisoned. So there was a lot of toxicity going on. And then there were other things as well, like quite harsh sounding surgical things you could do to try and get the lungs to rest as well. So yeah, but it was only in the 1940s that like an effective antibiotic really emerged for treating TB. Until then, a lot of the efforts were on managing the disease and preventing it, rather than trying to hunt for that magic bullet.
Yeah, sure. So do you know yet whether TB was more prevalent in postal workers as compared to other occupations, or is that sort of one of the hopes for the project to kind of find out?
Yeah, so one of the things, so it's definitely something we're going to try and find out, because TB is a very good sort of weather vane, right? It's very good for sort of looking at the health of a population as a whole. So we're still sort of looking from very provisional stuff I've done, so sort of not super scientific or sort of more sort of trailing through the data. I'm actually surprised at how little I'm finding TB as a cause of retirement amongst postal workers. That doesn't mean people didn't have TB, right? Because like they could have retired for a different reason. So it doesn't necessarily mean that TB wasn't prevalent in the post office. I just think that certain members, certain workers' organisations in the post office, you know, as you'll want to do when you're trying to like to gain attention not just from your employers but from like society at large about what you saw as a particularly prevalent problem, is you use quite sensationalist statistics. And you know, so I think Charles Garland says something like 45% of TB clerks, male TB clerks, died or retired from TB. From so far, our research does not bear that out as a thing. So yeah, and I guess one of the interesting things is to think about, like, you know, were postal workers actually, were they less affected by TB than the general population, right? If so, that tells us something about the various ways in which a regular wage and a pension might actually offer you protection from these infectious diseases that were often associated with like cramped living conditions and a poor diet, like TB.
So how were people allowed to take sick days, and what did that look like?
Yeah, you're absolutely allowed to take sick days. So you could take you had up to 6 months pay, full pay for sick leave, and then after that 6 months of half pay. But sometimes this could be extended in like exceptional circumstances. The only issue with that is this wasn't a time where you could, just like today, where you couldn't self-certify forever, right? So you had to get a doctor to come say, you know, this person is actually sick. And you'd have to do it with a doctor who was appointed by the post office or who worked for the post office. So there are some cases. So our PhD student Holly Marley recently came across a case of a telegraphist who had typhoid fever and was off for a very long time, and the medical officer essentially didn't quite believe him, it seems, and kept on pushing for, you know, more certification and saying like, I think doubting that this person was actually sick. And there's evidence that, you know, his family found that, like, in himself, found it very, very invasive and unprofessional. So even though it's very generous, this has to be qualified with the fact that, you know, you do have a very big sort of medical surveillance system going on, right, in the post office.
That's obviously biased.
Yeah, in some cases probably biased, yeah. We're finding that workers tended to take around 10 to 20 days off on average. But what's interesting as well is that we're finding that over time, workers took more time off. So someone working in the 1860s and 1870s took off less time in the worker who was working in the 1890s, for example. And the other interesting thing is we're also seeing some variations in taking sick leave across the UK. So, for example, 2/3 of London workers, for example, reported in sick each year, but only 1/3 of Scottish workers. But at the same time, the Scottish workers tended to take longer periods of time off. And again, these are all the things, we're getting these little patterns emerge and these little suggestive things, and we're not quite sure yet about the reasons behind this, but we're finding these interesting little tidbits from the data, and we just need more time in the archives, importantly, to kind of understand why these patterns are emerging.
I just could be Scots just double hard.
Yeah, I mean, there might be an important cultural thing there about work ethics and cultures of kind of sick leave and stuff. So yeah, we're really interested in finding that out.
That will be really, really interesting. So how can people find out? I kind of got two questions. So how can people find out more about postal workers generally?
Sure.
You got any sort of recommended places or tips?
Yeah. So if you're interested, I guess I'll answer this in two ways. So if you're interested in tracing a postal ancestor, I would say the first port of call will be the Postal Museum and Archives, who have really lovely, wonderful archivists who are so helpful. I've been going to those archives for years, and yeah, they're absolutely my favourite archives in London. And I've been to, sorry, very nerdy, I have favourite archives, but I do. They're absolutely my favourite archives to go to in London, and they are incredibly helpful and have great resources on their website. So just Google the Postal Museum Archives, you'll find great stuff there. If you found out you had a postal ancestor and you have access to Ancestry, Ancestry have the record set for the post office appointment books. They don't cover absolutely everyone, but they're really good for identifying when your postal ancestor was appointed. And interestingly, and I find this quite fun, is if they were a letter carrier or a postman, for example, they'll usually have details for their route. So they'll have like, like Hitchin to Luton, right? And what's interesting there is if you're very nerdy, you can go on Google Maps and like type in Hitchin to Luton. And this is very unscientific, I should say, because but you can see very approximately how long that route was. So you can get a good sense of how much your ancestor was walking every day, which I think is quite
even better. You can go to the National Library of Scotland online, where they have the historic maps, and you can layer them with the modern maps, and then you could get super geeky and see how their route has changed as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think in Find My Past as well, they have a declaration of age forms for the civil service, so you might find your ancestor there. Okay. And then in terms of if you're interested in postal history, the Postal Museum have a really great website full of with blogs and stuff. And then obviously I have to do a big shout out for our website here, which is addressinghealth.org.uk. We have blogs, we have presentations and talks, on lots of aspects relating not just to postal history, but the history of medicine, the history of pensions, and even the history of death certificates. One of my colleagues gave a really interesting talk on that. And we're always looking for contributors. So if you want to write about your postal ancestor and what you found out about them, please let us know. Our website, our email is addressinghealth@gmail.com, and we're always there. We're also on Twitter, so @postal health, and we love chatting. So there's just contact us basically. We're all big nerds and we all love to talk, and there's lots of ways to get in contact with us. And we have a newsletter, I should say. I've asked to shout out for the newsletter.
Sounds awesome. I've got I'll put all those links in the description below, so you should be able to view them really easily, so don't worry if you're sat there frantically writing.
Yes.
And if people want to find out a bit more about occupational health in general or medicine in general, what can they, have you got any hints, tips? I know you've got a book. I'd love to see the front cover, show it off. It'll be mirrored.
I just published Germs in the English Workplace circa 1880 to 1945. I think my publishers want me to do a bit of a shout out, so thank you. So that has some stuff on the post office. It's a bit expensive, so I forgive everyone if you don't want to buy the book. But again, if you're interested in anything relating to the history of occupational health in the post office, just contact us. I'm contactable as well. I'll put my email down here. If you're wanting to find out more about the history of medicine, occupational health, so again, I direct you towards our website. I direct you towards the Wellcome website. I direct you towards the London Museums of Health and Medicine website. The Science Museum have a fantastic resource on medicine. They just redeveloped their medicine galleries, and they have a fantastic online portal for their digital for their objects, and also just really, really great bits of really accessible writing about occupational health. And obviously we'll be looking towards developing some resources too, and particularly sorry, my brain's gone dumb. We'll be looking towards developing some resources too for anyone interested in the history of occupational health. So again, keep your eye on our website if you want to find out more. And as usual, if you're ever curious about something, I think something I'd really emphasize is if you find an academic who writes on something you find interesting and you can't access that paper because it's behind a paywall, or you want to find out more, I would really suggest getting in contact with them. I know it can seem a bit scary because you think, you know, they're these highfalutin professors, but in all honesty, we love talking about our research. We're big nerds, and we're more than happy usually to send you a copy of things and just chat. I mean, we might take a while to get back to you because, you know, of our workload and we're all busy and it's a pandemic, but absolutely do get in touch. You know, if you find a historian whose work you find interesting, they'll probably be more than happy to talk to you. You know, so that's my other tip really, which is just emailing and kind of getting those connections, which is...
No, I completely agree. I think Twitter's a brilliant place for meeting other historians from all different you know, backgrounds and professions, and yeah, you can always follow my shameless plug here for my other hat. You can always follow Historians Collaborate, which is at HistCollab on Twitter, and I'll put the link to that in the description as well. So thank you very much, Laura, for that whirlwind tour. It was really interesting, and I really thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you so much. I had a really great time talking. Thank you so much, Natalie.
You're welcome. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit subscribe or visit me at www.genealogystories.co.uk.